Many ancient beings stalk the shadows of the world of darkness, fearsome, godlike predators lurking in the shadows. None of them is more ancient, more fearful, or more godlike than the Arisen, ancient scions of a lost empire forced into a cycle of death and rebirth and driven by an all-consuming purpose. This is the world of darkness, but not as you know it. This is the world of the Arisen, the world of Mummy the Curse. Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and as you may have guessed from my somewhat slightly more dramatic than usual lead-in, in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at one of the more recent games in the New World of Darkness series from White Wolf / Onyx Publishing, which is Mummy the Curse. Now, this RPG was very successfully recently touted on Kickstarter and exceeded all of its aims on Kickstarter. Now, like many other World of Darkness games, the players in this RPG take on the role of supernatural protagonists. In this case, the Arisen, as they call themselves, or mummies. And they are once servants of an ancient, pre-ancient Egypt empire known as Irem. Recipients of an ancient rite called the Rite of Return. It allows them to resurrect continually and return from their deaths in response to certain stimulus. Now, during this review, you'll have to forgive me if I look down at my notes somewhat more than usual. There's quite a lot crammed into this very attractive book, and it took a considerable amount of my note paper. Once I'd started writing the review, I may have got a little bit carried away with it. Now, the front of the book has a very attractive sand-covered finish on it, which you should just be able to see there. And there's an Egyptian eye motif, which you should just about be able to see there. And this links in with the styles of some of the old World of Darkness mummy books, which had vaguely similar looking covers, although this steps it up a notch in terms of the visual presentation. The attractiveness continues on the interior art of the book, which is all rendered in a sort of sepia-ish but slightly more yellowy tones, along with the usual grayscale. And to give you an example of some of the very attractive art, if you have a look there, you can see one of the many attractive multi-paneled pictures in the book, and this high visual standard of artwork is kept up throughout the entire book. Extremely high quality, so that's a definite tick in the plus points for this book. The book opens with some fiction which describes the rising of one of the protagonists, one of the mummies, the Arisen, from his sarcophagus, as seen through the eyes of one of the mummy's modern day cultists. This ties in with the fact that Mummy is one of the few New World of Darkness games to actively promote a style of play wherein all of the players are not playing the de facto supernatural that the book's concerning. In fact, as we'll discuss later, the game goes into quite some depths to suggest the idea that you may not want to have everyone playing Arisen. You may want to have one person as an Arisen. You may want to have the other players playing members of their cult or allies, etc. It describes this as a pyramid style of play, with one mummy and numerous underlings. The introduction of the book is very well written and clearly defines the main theme of the game as memory. My only gripe with the introduction is that the font chosen for the main title, and you can see an example of it on the page there, although ironically it actually looks a bit better in the somewhat low light in my book room, is that because it's an outline font with a white interior on a white page, in some places it's quite difficult to read, and unfortunately this colour scheme is used on the main headings throughout the book and makes some of the chapter headings difficult to work out. The font works fine when it's used in the more mainstream black further down for like subheadings, but white on white's never been a good idea, and it's just an unfortunate little niggle that sometimes makes things a little bit difficult to read. One of the main differences between Mummy and other World of Darkness lines is that the book is clearly split into two segments. The first is for the players and the STs, whereas the second is solely for the ST's benefit, and it's recommended that it not be read by the players. Now, when the Arisen first awaken, they only have fragmentary memories of who and what they are. A certain amount of instinctual memory is programmed into them, the ability to know how to use their abilities and powers, for instance, by the right of the return. However, the game decides to represent this lack of memory and this theme of discovery, identity, and finding oneself by keeping a lot of the information that would normally be available to anyone in another World of Darkness game solely in the purview of the ST. And I think this is an interesting idea, but it has resulted in the idea, in the info inside the book, excuse me, not being ordered in quite the way you may expect, and not quite as logically as it has been in some other books. The player section begins by discussing what commonly held superstitions and tropes are true when it comes to the Arisen. Now, this is a common thing that has been done throughout many other World of Darkness books, and it's a great icebreaker that sort of brings the players in and lets them know what to expect when they're concerning the new World of Darkness mummies, or the Arisen as they call themselves. It also gives a brief rundown on how the Arisen came to be. This is fairly general since, as I was saying earlier, one of the main themes of the game is this theme of self-discovery. And the idea is that there's supposed to be lots of mysteries and little facets of the background that aren't really covered in the player section that you can explore as your character's memory improves and as you explore the world that your character awakes to find himself in. All of the text is extremely well written and very interesting, written quite clearly, covering topics from the history of the ancient pre-Egyptian civilization of Irem, where the Arisen were first died and had the right of return cast on them, to the Xiantu and the casting of the right of return, which allows them to resurrect themselves. One of the most interesting aspects of the Mummy for me is that it flips the normal power dynamic common in World of Darkness games on its head somewhat. For instance, if you're playing a vampire game, you'd more than likely, in the majority of games, start off as a young neonate vampire, hoping to survive long enough to gain power, knowledge, and understanding of the new supernatural world in which you find yourself, gradually building upon the innate powers in your vampiric blood and hoping to eventually reach the exalted heights of being an elder. In Mummy, you rise from slumber into a strange mortal world, not of your making, as a little more than a bandage skeleton animated by the energies of Sekhem moving through your corpse. However, the power of a veritable god is at your fingertips, but at that moment of awakening, you know little more than your overriding purpose, whether this to be to destroy the people who have attempted to defile your tomb, or to carry out some request that has resulted in your cult raising you from your slumber. But you don't really have any sense of self or any sort of great degree of personality to inform your uses of this power. As time goes on, your memory gradually starts to improve and you start to look more human as the raw, unadulterated power of Sekhem slowly fades and you become a more sort of idealized version of what your character would have looked like in their normal life. But as your memory improves, so your Sekhem continues to fade. The almost godlike powers that you are blessed with upon your first arising slowly start to ebb away, and your character feels the ever gradual drain of their energies, which will eventually result in them returning to their slumber. Now, I think this is an excellent inversion of the normal power curve in World of Darkness games, and it opens up new possibilities for different types of horror. For instance, one of the most compelling things for me is when you first arise with very little knowledge of what's going on, Do you risk using all of this mighty power at your behest to correct what you see as injustices or wrongs, but you run the risk of the fact that your initial summarization of the situation may be incorrect? For example, what if that person running into your tomb or running from your tomb, who you assume to be a grave desecrator and you smite down and destroy in your anger, what if they actually turn out to be a member of your cult coming down into your tomb to warn you of an even greater danger, and you have deprived yourself of a valuable resource? What if the person coming down is actually one of your allies who has been blessed with a shadow of your own immortality and has patiently awaited out the eons to be the first face that you see upon your arising, but in your anger you do not recognize them and you destroy them? Or do you wait until you have the appropriate knowledge and memory to use your powers, but run the risk of knowing that if you wait too long, you may not actually have enough power, enough godly might to deal with whatever threats you are facing? The book then goes on to discuss different guild affiliations of the various Arisen, and these are ancient societies that all Arisen belonged to back in ancient Irem. And these cover things from the Marquep, the creators of mystical amulets, to the Masons of the Tef-Habi, the masters of icons and effigies. Anyone familiar with World of Darkness games will recognize these as the game splats, the various choices of which, for example, the equivalent will be clans in Vampire, and they grant access to various abilities. Mummy goes a little further than most of the games when it adds a few extra layers of customization and detail that are built on top of this. Each Arisen, upon the occasion of his first death, finds himself faced with many trials in Duat, or the Underworld. These trials are designed to strip away the various extraneous rubbish that we accumulate throughout our mortal lives, leaving only the essential core or essence of the prospective Arisen in place, until eventually they find themselves faced with one of the many judges of Duat, divine spiritual presences that sit in judgment over those souls that come to the afterlife. The final judge that he faces will be the one that has the most affinity with the potential Arisen's most essential aspect, and that judge places a stamp of ownership upon the spirit or the soul of the future Arisen. And this also gives access to some additional abilities, as well as providing some ideas about what sort of characteristics you might like to think about for your character, what sort of personality archetypes tend to be drawn towards certain judges. It all adds a few additional layers of background information and interest onto your character. The rest of the character generation is fairly standard World of Darkness fare, with some alterations and additions to take into account the addition of the Mummy Supernatural template on top of the normal mortal character genning rules from the new World of Darkness. For example, morality is replaced by memory, which instead of starting off high and decreasing as your character degenerates into a monster, starts off low when you arise as a monster with very little humanity, and then steadily you begin to remember your past lives and more of your human-like self. You also gain ratings in 5 pillars, which are Ab, the heart, Bar, the spirit, Essence, which is the car, Name, which is Ren, and Shadow, which is Shoot. These ratings allow you access to different powers. Effectively, they serve in the place of like discipline levels would in Vampire, and you spend them to either increase your stats, flooding your body with Sechem, or to access certain of your abilities. Starting mummies also receive 20 XP to represent their age and power even upon their initial rising, and guidelines are given if you want to start out a little bit more powerful than that. My main complaint about this section is that there is so much stuff crammed into these chapters. And don't get me wrong, I always say that more options when it comes to character creation are good. You can't give a player character too many choices. However, in this case, because of the way the chapters are organised, it can make it very difficult to quickly track down relevant info during play. The book's index really isn't a great deal of help in this regard. During the game I ran recently, which was only a one-off game, and I'm sure as you got more used to looking things up in terms of a campaign, it would become easier. I was forced to make quite a lot of judgment calls rather than waste a lot of time looking up the strictly accurate results in the book. The game would really have benefited, in my opinion, from some form of cheat sheet or quick reference sheet that could have been slotted in, perhaps on the extraneous blank page that was at the back of my own copy of the book from Drive-Thru RPG, and obviously a better index would have helped in this regard. There is a merit called Tomb, which is an expanded merit, rather like Haven for Vampire, where you can apportion out your attribute dots to a number of subheadings under the main Tomb merit heading. And this befits a sacred place where the mummy can rest, sleep through the ages, and recover their energy reserves. One slightly odd thing is that the cult merit is not discussed in this section along with all of the other merits. Now, it is given a chapter sometime later in the book, its own chapter, which does, I suppose, emphasise how important cults are to the Arisen. After all, if you know that you're going to sleep away large portions through the ages and awake with very little memory or sense of how to adjust to a new world, you're going to place great value in having a body of people there who can help you quickly adjust to a new world and provide you with those little things we all take for granted, for instance, appropriate clothing, transport, etc. So it's quite appropriate that the cult merit does have its own chapter. However, the fact that it's not placed near or with the other merits is somewhat jarring, and it just seems a little bit odd, to be honest, and it increases the amount of page flipping you have to do to find things during the game. We then have a section dealing with which of the pillars is a mummy's primary concern. Again, adding further customization to the character and access to certain abilities. Each of these entries is really beautifully and nicely tied in to the whole idea of Egyptian mythology, equating each pillar with an Egyptian animal. For instance, those who follow the ways of Ab, or the pillar of the heart, are often described as lion-headed, and those who follow Shut, or the ways of the shadow, are described as jackal-headed. Again, the order of this section in relation to others doesn't really scan well. It doesn't really follow the order you'd expect if you were going through the book generating your character as you did, and there'll probably be some flipping backwards and forwards through the various sections during character generation. However, it's not too bad. Like I say, it's just a little bit jarring. The next chapter cover affinities, which are Sekhem bestowed minor abilities, instinctive powers that your mummy can call upon. These are granted to them by the right of return, and utterances, which are more lengthy spells or chantings that are powers that were once taught in ancient Irem by the various guilds. And these powers cover a whole gamut of things, from those great B-movie mummy powers like exhaling a swarm of scarabs, all the B-movie powers you could ever want, and some really nice abilities that draw on the imagery of this pre-Egyptian mythology theme of the game. The book then discusses the Arisen condition, how they wear a simulation of real flesh constructed from Sekhem that gradually comes to resemble an idealized form of the body that they possessed during their real life. Even as their memories return, however, their power ebbs and they slowly slide inexorably back towards the sleep of ages. At this point, the mummies have the ability to track relics, which are mystical items containing Sekhem or magical energy. It's discussed and is a very useful tenet, given that one of their reasons for existing is to return such items to the judges in the spirit world. When a mummy's immortal nature is revealed, or they call on large amounts of Sekhem to power their greatest of abilities. Mortals nearby can fall prey to Sybaris, which is a mortal fear and instinctive dread of the inevitability of death. And this can manifest as anything from extreme bouts of depression and suicidal tendencies to crazed hallucinations of spirits and Egyptian death gods. One thing covered in this chapter is that mummies are virtually indestructible, being able to survive pretty much anything up to and including the destruction of their original body. However, each time they are forced to die and return with their task unfulfilled, they grow a little bit weaker and a little bit nearer to falling into the long slumber. However, as a mummy's sechem levels gradually decrease as time passes, or more rapidly for those mummies who attempt to deny or do not actively pursue the purpose that they have been returned from the spirit world for, whether this is, as we said earlier, to prevent the defilement of their tomb, or whether it's a purpose imposed on them by their cult, if the cult summoned them from their long slumber, the sechem slowly ebbs away, bringing them ever closer to their long repose again. The discussion of cults in the next chapter is extremely interesting and breaks them down into three types, which are tribal, conspiracy, and enterprise. Each has various benefits and complications, and this chapter nicely rounds things off, although as I said earlier, splitting this one merit off from the others is a little odd. Book 2 is the ST section of the book, the storyteller section of the book, and it goes into far more detail about the history of Lost Irem and the Arisen. Now, I'm not going to go into it in too much extensive detail here because part of this game is the rediscovery of this information and the recovery of memory, and I wouldn't want to spoil it or ruin it for anyone who's going to be playing in a Mummy the Cursed game. However, it is fantastically well written and is very evocative of the themes of the game. The ST section goes on to discuss antagonists for a Mummy Chronicle, and these range from Other Arisen to the Deceived, which are a lost guild believed destroyed in ancient Irem, who allegedly have an insane mastery of true name magic, to the Lifeless or Amkata, who are chimerical abominations that lurk in the spirit world, hungry for stolen sechem to give them a blasphemous semblance of life and allow them to walk in the real world. There's the Schwanknessen, who are murderous offshoots or cast-offs of the Rite of Return, sacrifices that were made to allow the original rite, whose spirits have bound themselves to a great devourer from the underworld or Duat, and who now seek to drag the Arisen down to their level, either converting them or destroying them permanently. The chapter contains some very interesting samples of the various antagonists. It also includes an expanded list of noumena and abilities for ghosts and spirits. Now, this is a great addition given that Arisen spend at least a portion of their time in the underworld between each life cycle, although it's suggested that this not be given undue focus in the game since it may lead to players who are not involved in that sitting out for long periods of time, and I think that's certainly a wise choice to make. One of the noumena for spirits, Lucid Dead, effectively allows a ghost an increased sense of personality and more mortal-like abilities, effectively allowing a ghost to be treated as a player character and to gain XP. There's also a number of other noumena associated with it that allow increased interactions with the mortal world, which would really make a ghost player character feasible in a Mummy Chronicle, or these rules could be quite easily taken and imported wholesale into any other World of Darkness game. Now, I've always thought that having firm, solid rules for playing Ghost PCs was something that was lacking in the new World of Darkness, and this section of the book is one of the many hidden little gems in Mummy the Curse to me, and was a brilliant, great surprise when I came across it in the book. And it's just an interesting alternate facet of the Arisen's life, because although they are technically immortal, you should always bear in mind that the Arisen always have at least one foot in the spirit world. Many of their powers are slanted towards drawing on this connection with the spirit world, allowing them to deal with ghosts or the corpses of the dead or the spirits of those who have passed. And having been able to call on perhaps allies, contacts who are spirits, emphasizes that, and it also gives a great additional option if you're running a game where one of the players is portraying the Arisen and the other players are controlling his allies or contacts. Rather than just having them all being human, it adds a little extra level of detail, just a nice little something extra that you can throw in there. There's a large list of relics that follows that, and although I'm not normally particularly keen on massive lists of kit or equipment, I must say that the write-ups of these relics are all very interesting, and they're fairly bursting with plot potential. There's not one of them I looked at where I couldn't think immediately of 2 or 3 story ideas that I could use them in, so that's a great thing. Then we move on to the final chapters, which deal with the more unique challenges of running a mummy game as opposed to a normal World of Darkness game, given that aside from time periods of roughly 1461 years, called in the game the Sothic Turn, which coincides with the cycles of the star Sirius, and this is a period of time when all mummies awaken at once without any overriding purpose. But aside from that, most Arisen have a fairly solitary lifestyle with regards to their own kind. As one way of dealing with this, the game suggests having a single Arisen with other players portraying cultists, allies, etc., as we spoke about earlier, possibly rotating who gets to play the mummy, and this is described as a pyramid style of play. I love the fact that this section discusses the descent and using it to promote proactivity in a game, since a mummy who is inactive will eventually lose by default as their sechem gradually ebbs away and they are forced back into their eternal sleep. The section goes on to discuss in detail the various styles that can be brought to a mummy game, ranging from the 1920s pulp style to a occult horror theme, and then it rounds off with a sample scenario that is perfectly adequate. So, what is my verdict on Mummy the Curse? Well, in terms of good points, the artwork in the book is absolutely stunning. The setting combines the best of the B-movie tropes of various mummy movies, along with Egyptian mythology and an atmosphere of occult horror, as well as the personal horror of the inevitable ebbing away of one's vitality. In a sense, something of a metaphor for life, that as your mental faculties, your ability to perceive the world increases, eventually time will force your own body to betray you. And that's a sobering thought. Rules are fairly standard World of Darkness, and so anyone who has a passing familiarity with either New World of Darkness or Core World of Darkness will have no problems adapting to them. However, it's not massively newbie friendly, to be honest, and really does reward having an ST who knows the rules a little bit better than you might have to with some other games. For instance, you will certainly not be creating any and playing any characters within the first few minutes of the game. However, the trade-off with that is, although it does take a long time to create characters, that's mainly because there's an awful lot of customization and options for your characters. There's a lot of different routes you can potentially take them down, and these all add to the gaming experience, which can only be a good thing. There's potential for many different styles of play, and due to the mummy's nature of rising at certain times and in response to certain stimulus, there's also a lot of opportunities for a historical period hopping campaign where you play the mummy at various points in history. There's even possibility for jumping about a lot using flashbacks and historical side missions, which is covered in some detail by the book's Storyteller session. Now, bad points. Some of the text, especially some of the larger headings, borders on unreadable. The game is probably better suited for campaign play than for one-off play. When I ran a one-off game of it, although we all enjoyed it, there was an awful lot of book flipping, and the character generation did take a considerable amount of time. However, once you'd got into it and you were running in a campaign, I'm pretty sure you'd have everything you ever needed on your character sheet. The book could have done with a reference sheet or a cheat sheet to help you locate or easily look up the most pertinent facts in the book. The index in the book doesn't embolden the main entries, and therefore it's pretty much useless for finding anything in a hurry, although you will eventually be able to use it to track down whatever information you're after. Overall, I would say that Mummy the Curse is a great book that looks beautiful, and it expands the World of Darkness in a new and interesting direction, introducing several themes which have not been present in other World of Darkness lines. I'd recommend it more for campaign play than I would for one-off. However, if you're interested in a World of Darkness game, potentially one with a more troop style of play or a pyramid style of play, then you could do far worse than getting yourself a copy of Mummy the Curse. Overall, I'd certainly give it a 2 thumbs fresh, and I'm glad that it's one of my purchases off Drive-Thru RPG, and I look forward to running games of it in the future. Well, that's my review of Mummy the Curse. If you have any comments on this game or this review, please leave them in the comments box below. I hope that if you've liked this review, you'll consider clicking on like and subscribing to my channel. Until I see you next time in whatever video I make next, I look forward to reading what you write. Thank you very much for watching and listening.